Hello everyone. Today we will be starting chapter 4, Biological Identity. In the activity 1, we are going to explain the relation existing between proteins, being the expression of genes, and the phenotype. We will define phenotype, define genotype, and find the relation between genes, proteins, genotype, and phenotype. As you know, and have already discussed and explained in the previous chapters, that one gene, which is a fragment of DNA, codes for one protein. Now in this chapter, we will see how do proteins affect the phenotype. As an introduction for this chapter, you know that the DNA is replicated in the nucleus, and the DNA is decomposed into genes. Now the genes, by transcription, give mRNA, messenger RNA, which is an intermediate molecule serving for protein synthesis. The mRNA is translated into proteins within the cytoplasm. Now, these proteins will determine the traits or the characters of an individual. The proteins, by their presence or their absence, will determine the traits. You know that proteins could be enzymes, could be pigments, could be hormones, etc. And the presence or the absence of these proteins will form the phenotype. Thus, the phenotype can be defined as the group of characters, visible or hidden, of an individual. We can say thus that the genotype deals with gene codes, meaning proteins, while the phenotype deals with looks, with traits. So the expression of the genotype into proteins contributes to the phenotype. It's the big relation between the genotype and the phenotype. Okay, so the phenotype is the expression of the genotype. Now, in part 2, what is the relation between proteins and phenotype? We will discuss this relation. First of all, let's study the phenotype at 3 levels. The phenotype could be studied at 3 levels. Yani, we have the macroscopic level, we have the cellular level, and the molecular one. Concerning the macroscopic level, it's the visible characters that are accessible to the naked eye of an individual. The macroscopic level comprises all the visible characters for an individual. Example, the hair color, the eye color, the ear form, for example, and the visible symptoms of a disease, etc. Now, this macroscopic level is affected by the cellular level or the microscopic level, not visible to the naked eye. The cellular level comprises the functioning, the composition, or the shape of the concerned cells. For example, in this document, we have normal shape of red blood cells, which is a spherical shape for a normal individual, whereas in this figure, we have a deformed, elongated, sickled form of red blood cells in the case of a disease called sickle cell anemia that will be discussed later in the next slides. So, the cellular level in the case of sickle cell anemia is the abnormal elongated form of the red blood cell. This elongated abnormal form of the red blood cell will cause a disease called sickle cell anemia, anemia فقر دم, which is the macroscopic phenotype. Anemia is a macroscopic phenotype characterized by pale skin, fatigue, etc. So you see, the cellular phenotype affects the macroscopic phenotype. Now, passing to the molecular level, the molecular level studies the functioning of proteins produced by cells. Example, the presence or the absence of a protein or the production of an abnormal protein. Here we have two examples. The case of diabetes, السكري. The diabetes, the symptoms of diabetes اللي هن frequent urination, اللي هن high glucose levels in the blood, etc. The symptoms of diabetes constitute the macroscopic level of the phenotype. This macroscopic level of the phenotype is due to an abnormal production or the absence of production of insulin by the pancreatic cell. Thus, it's the cellular level. The pancreatic cells cannot produce a normal insulin. In the molecular level, in the case of diabetes, diabetes is due to the absence of insulin. Insulin, it is a hormone, so it's a functional protein. So at the molecular level, we say that there is no insulin or there is production of an abnormal insulin. This abnormal production of insulin causes diabetes, يعني affects the macroscopic level. As for the case of sickle cell anemia, the deformation in the form of the red blood cells is due to what? Is due to the production of an abnormal hemoglobin molecule. Hemoglobin, you know, it's a structural protein found in red blood cells whose role is to carry the respiratory gases. So, when hemoglobin is abnormal, the shape of the red blood cells is deformed, is altered, and thus we have the sickle cell anemia. In this part, we will talk about the relation between functional proteins and phenotype. Then in the next part, we will talk about the relation between the structural proteins and the phenotype. For the relation between phenotype and functional proteins, we have the case of albinism. You know that the pigmentation of the skin, the skin color, the eyes and hair, is a complex process that results from the synthesis of specific pigments, melanin, where in the melanocytes, which are the epidermal cells. So here we have a cut of the skin. You have the skin cells called melanocytes, and these melanocytes will produce melanin. Melanin is a pigment responsible for the pigmentation of our skin, our eyes, and our hair. Now, the synthesis of melanin requires a chain of biosynthesis whose main raw material is tyrosine. Tyrosine is an amino acid that can be found in food. We can take tyrosine directly from food, from alimentation, or tyrosine derives from the transformation of another amino acid called phenylalanine under the action of an enzyme called enzyme 1. Now, tyrosine, by the action of enzyme 2 called tyrosinase, will be transformed into melanin. So إذا بتفكر بهالطريقة melanin, its absence or its presence depends on the absence or the presence of tyrosine, which means if there is any deficiency in enzyme 1, phenylalanine could not or cannot give tyrosine. And if there is an abnormality in enzyme 2, even if tyrosine is present, but melanin will be not produced since the enzyme 2 is abnormal or absent. So we say that tyrosinase is an important enzyme. Enzyme means functional protein. You know that all enzymes, all hormones are said to be functional proteins. Thus, tyrosinase, which is a functional protein, it's an important enzyme involved in the melanin biosynthetic chain. This tyrosinase, since it's an enzyme, a protein, so it is coded by a certain gene. The gene that codes for tyrosinase is located on chromosome 11, and it is called tyr gene, tyr for tyrosinase. Now, the concerned disease, albinism. What is albinism? Albinism is known as a hereditary disease. Hereditary disease and a disease caused by an abnormality in the gene expression. This disease affects pigmentation, yani skin color, eye color, hair color, and it is characterized by a lack of production of melanin. So the cause of albinism is the absence of melanin, which means that the melanocytes that normally synthesize melanin, in the case of albinism, these melanocytes synthesize little or no melanin, thus resulting in a hypopigmentation of the skin, hair, eyelashes, and eyes. Yani, the albino individual has a very light skin, white hairs, and iris not colored. What is the cause of albinism? And what is the cause of the lack of production of melanin? The lack in the production of melanin is due to either the production of abnormal enzyme 1, as discussed in the previous slide, or in most cases to the absence of tyrosinase or the production of abnormal tyrosinase. Since we have already seen that tyrosinase transforms tyrosine into melanin. If tyrosine is not transformed into melanin, or if tyrosine is absent, thus melanin will not be produced and we have albinism. Now, you have to answer the following questions. Pick out from the text. You should pick out the whole sentence or the exact expression or scientific terms. Pick out from the text the molecule responsible for pigmentation, the abnormal phenotype or disease due to the absence of this molecule, and finally the cause of its absence. Yani why is this molecule absent in our case? Take few minutes to answer these questions. So we can say the molecule responsible for pigmentation is melanin. The disease caused by the absence of melanin is albinism. And the cause of the absence of melanin is either the production of abnormal enzyme 1 or the lack of the production of tyrosinase. So the production of abnormal enzyme 1 and in most cases the absence of tyrosinase or abnormal tyrosinase production. Now you have to complete the following table concerning albinism. It's a comparative table between a healthy individual and albino one. We have to pick out or to draw out the characteristics of the macroscopic phenotype, of the cellular phenotype, and of the molecular phenotype in a healthy individual and an albino one. I repeat, macroscopic phenotype is the group of all traits or visible characters. Cellular phenotype, all related to cell functioning or cell structure or shape. And the molecular phenotype is determined by the absence or the presence of a certain protein, enzyme, or hormone. Take few minutes to complete this table. So for the macroscopic phenotype, a healthy individual shows normal pigmentation of the skin, the hair, and the iris, while an albino individual shows a hypopigmentation or no pigmentation for the skin, the hair, the eyelashes, the eyes. The skin is light, the hairs are white, and the iris is not colored. Concerning the cellular phenotype, the melanocytes, which are the cells that normally produce melanin, in the case of a healthy individual, the melanocytes synthesize or produce normal melanin. Whereas in the albino individual, melanocytes, which are the epidermal cells, synthesize little or no melanin. So in the case of albinism, the functioning of the cell is altered and not its shape. For the molecular phenotype, the molecular phenotype is related to the absence or the presence of a certain protein, certain enzyme, or certain hormone. In our case, a healthy individual has a functional tyrosinase enzyme, which is responsible for the production of a normal melanin. Whereas an albino individual has either a non-functional enzyme 1 or a non-functional tyrosinase enzyme or a tyrosinase enzyme having very reduced activity, which will cause the absence of melanin. أكيد don't forget to put a title for the table. It's a comparative table between a healthy individual and an albino one. In the next slides, this table will be repeated, and you have to complete it in the same way as we have completed in the case of albinism.